Charlie and I wrote this book, The Rapture of the Nerds. We started writing it about 7 years ago as a kind of experiment. Charlie and I had corresponded, and he said, you know, would you like to collaborate on something? So he sent me a chunk of a manuscript, the first 500 or 1,000 words of a story called Jury Service, and I read them, and they were quite gonzo. I mean, really, really gonzo. And I thought, all right, challenge accepted. So I wrote the most gonzo sort of follow-on 500,000 words that I could think of and sent them back to him. And then he did the same, right? And back and forth we went and ended up writing this thing that's very silly and very fun. And it was much loved, so much so that there was a lot of demand for a sequel. So we wrote another story called Appeals Court. And those two seemed like they were unfinished. And Tor asked us if we would finish them and do a write-through and turn it into one book. So we wrote this third piece, which is called Parole Board. And that's the new chunk that we're going to read from a little later today. And the whole thing, with a thoroughgoing edit, became Rapture of the Nerds, the book that you can pick up back there. And I'm going to just say a few words about kind of the thematic nature of the book, and then Charlie will say a few words as well, and then we'll each do a brief reading. The title, Rapture of the Nerds, comes from another writer, Ken MacLeod, Scottish Trotskyist science fiction writer of some great merit and thoughtfulness. And Ken was one of the first people to notice that the Singularity bears a marked similarity to the notion of the Rapture and the Left Behind novels, and this idea that there will come a time when people who possess a specific virtue will disappear from the earth, leaving only the unvirtuous behind, only instead of people who have faithfully adhered to Bronze Age doctrine going away to heaven. This would be techies and nerds and skeptics and math people who would be comfortable with having their brains stuck in computers and being disassembled here on Earth and uploaded to a cloud. So that's the notion of the book, is to try and sort of explore an inverse of being left behind, a left behind where the people left behind are the people who are skeptical about uploading. And it's something that I like to think of as the progressive apocalypse. So it's, before the Enlightenment, we had this idea of lapsarianism, the idea that things were getting worse and worse every year, that, we were kicked out of the garden, and every year that went by, we fell further and further from grace. And it's kind of easy to understand how lapsarianism would seem like a natural and credible idea. After all, by the time you hit sort of the last 10% of your natural lifespan, it seems pretty apparent that things are getting worse. After all, didn't everything used to taste better, and didn't everything used to smell better? Weren't the people of your preferred gender prettier? Didn't you hurt less? I mean, clearly the world is a worse place than it was. And I think the human imagination balks at unbounded systems. We think, well, if things are going to get worse and worse, eventually they'll reach a point of, as Spinal Tap would have put it, none more worse. And that none more worse is the apocalypse, right? When things can't get any more worse, you have a break. Everything comes to a crashing halt. Now, along comes the Enlightenment and the idea that things are just going to get better, that we will stand on the shoulders of giants, and then people will stand on our shoulders, and then they'll stand on theirs, and so on, all the way up to the contemporary notion of Moore's Law, and the idea that things are getting better and better. And again, we confront this unbounded system, and we go, well, there must come a time when things can get none more better, when the balloon has inflated so much that it bursts, and we reach a break with history. We cease to be humans as we understand it. And that's the other theme that we explore in this book, this idea that the singularity is in many ways attractive, not because it's credible, but because our brain likes the idea of a bounding condition on this otherwise unbounded system. So that's the book, and I'm going to let Charlie talk about it a bit first, and then do some reading, and then I'll come back and do some reading, and then we'll take your questions.
Well, so the singularity. It's an interesting term. It really got introduced in the science fiction field around 1992 by Vernor Vinge, who you've probably heard of and may well have read. Science fiction writer, Hugo Nebula winner, also a now retired professor of computer science. Werner's version of a singularity was a lot more constrained and, dare I say it, grounded than the version that's become common currency among transhumanists these days. Werner's version was essentially a hypothesis about artificial intelligence, that if we can build a human equivalent AI, then it should in principle be possible to make it think faster than a regular human being just by throwing more computing resources at it, assuming it's not bottlenecked which, and as the brain is a thoroughly parallel architecture, there's no reason to suppose it would be. He also speculated further that if there are fundamentally more powerful modes of cognition than human consciousness, if there are forms of intelligence that are as much more powerful than our thinking as we are than, say, a frog, then once you have really, really, really fast human equivalent AIs, they will make a breakthrough to a strongly transhuman form of intelligence, if such a breakthrough is possible at all. And at that point, the brakes are off, and we are not setting the agenda for the universe we inhabit. This was Werner's original context for Singularity, and he wrote some novels about it starting from, I think, the late 1980s with Marooned in Real Time and subsequent. But it wasn't long before this cross-fertilized with some interesting subcultures relating to each other via the internet. The early transhumanists, the extropians. I don't know if anyone here was on the extropians mailing list in the late 80s, early 90s. I see some recognition. And like a giant katamari of weird ideas, it began sort of accreting baggage as it rolled downhill. Among the bits of baggage it acquired, well, molecular nanotechnology and magic nanite pixie dust probably need no further explanation, but mind uploading, the idea that we can dissect bits of our brains, analyze the signal processing therein, and ultimately port whatever representation we have of a human mind to run on different hardware. And of course, once we're running in a computer, there's no reason we can't make our sim very pleasant to live in. It's AI heaven time. And hey, we're all going to go flying up into the computers, live in the Google Cloud for that matter. I'm not sure that's such a good idea, but I digress. And this sort of began accreting all sorts of theological baggage. It got to the point where I found myself being sort of pinned into corners at SF conventions by people with no context of personal space who wanted to know how long it would be before they could abandon the meat puppet. Now, this struck me as slightly disturbing. And when one goes looking for parallels, it doesn't take long to find them. From around 950 AD onwards, Western Europe was sort of hit by wave after wave of cults, if you like, where the peasants would sort of abandon their farms, abandon their clothes, trash the joint and go and form free love communes, marauding around Europe, because they knew Jesus was going to come and spirit them away to heaven within the next few weeks. And this sort of kept up for about 50 to 100 years, periodically being put down by fire and the sword by the nobility with the enthusiastic backing of the church, who disapproved of this kind of thing. But it has had echoes ever since. Christian eschatology came up with the revelation of St. John around the 2nd century, and ever since then, as Cory noted, there has been the apocalyptic trend embedded very deeply in our culture. If we fast forward to the 18th century and the Scottish Enlightenment, we have a changeover, to some extent a reaction against a very dour fundamentalist Presbyterian theology of the theocracy that ran Scotland for a couple of centuries until the early 18th century, resulting in a new, more optimistic vision of the world whereby things can get better and better all the time and we can improve ourselves. But it's still the same apocalyptic imagery and urge. And the Rapture of the Nerds was, to some extent, an attempt to grapple with the theological and aesthetic underpinnings of singularitarianism. More recently, if you want to find the missing link to the extropians and the transhumanists, you really need to look at the 1920s Russian movement known as the Cosmists. If you think of sort of 1920s Russian revolutionary communist extropians, most of them in America are libertarians these days, that's where you find them. They got their scheme from a theologian, Nikolai Fedorov, late 19th century Russian Orthodox theologian and teacher. He taught Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, the father of rocketry, among other things. And Fedorov came up with an almost barking teleology, framed in terms of Christian thought. First of all, given that we have a theological impetus to improve ourselves towards perfection, to converge with godliness, Fedorov concluded that a necessary step on this was the complete unification of humanity and the abolition of war. How do you do this? Well, you find them something more important to wage war on, like, say, death. So Fedorov came up with this proposal that we should work on human immortality, expansion into space, giving human beings the ability to photosynthesize and move between worlds. We're talking 1890s here, I should add. And this, however, was not where the buck stopped, because let us suppose we've inherited the entire cosmos, we're de facto omnipotent and immortal. It is an insult to our existence that there are still human beings mouldering in the grave, that we must therefore then seek to resurrect every human being who had ever lived, and moreover, every human being on every timeline that could have given rise to the present day. Now, if you put that in your pipe and smoke it, it's some pretty heady stuff. And as I said, this stuff, 1920s Leninists, 1890s Russian Orthodox Christian theologians, 2010 Raymond Kurzweil. It has what the police in the UK refer to as form. You know, it's come up on their radar before. Shall I start?
Yeah. You're reading.
And so I'd like to read a chunk to you today, if I can get this machine to recognize me, explaining how Hugh finds himself, Hugh, our protagonist, finds herself, I should add. Hugh started out male and ends up female, and it gets complicated thereafter. How Hugh ends up in the digital afterlife. And I should add, Hugh is a curmudgeonly Welsh green who runs a pottery and trusts no technology more complex than his bicycle. Her, by this point. No, I thought the bike had been crushed. Anyway. Continuity. Hugh, it's a new bike. Hugh is holding her right hand under the cold water tap and swearing when there's another knock at the door. Who is it? She calls down the hall. It's the Singularity, a booming voice replies. What do you want? Everything is different now. I don't want any. If I could just have a moment of your time. It takes a lot of skill to make a stentorian voice box emit a credible wheedle, but the bell ringer at the door has clearly practiced it to a fine art. Hugh turns the faucet back up and puts her fingers into the cold stream. They're vicious little burns, red welts that her honest baseline human cells will take weeks to properly heal. Of course she could just ride over to the McNanites and get some salve that'd make them vanish before her eyes, but Hugh's endured much worse, and she's still got enough stubborn stockpiled to last her a couple of aeons. There's another thud at the door. Thud. Thud. Thud, thud, thud. Then a transhuman tattoo of thuds in rising frequency. Individual thuds blurring into a composite buzz that gets the bones of the old house rattling in sympathy, shivering down little hisses of plaster dust from the joints in the ceiling. Hugh uses her good hand to wrench the faucet off, then wraps a tea towel around her throbbing, dripping fingers and walks to the door, gritting her teeth with every step as she forces herself not to run. It feels like the house might rattle down around her ears any second, but she won't give the infinity botherer outside the satisfaction. She opens the door with the same measured calm. Let one of these fundies know you're on edge, and he'll try to grab the psychological advantage and work it until you agree to hear his balls. Sorry, pitch. Freudian slip there. I said, Hugh says, I don't want any. I'm afraid I rather must insist, says the infinity botherer, through his augmented celestial voice box. The force of that voice makes Hugh take an involuntary wincing step backwards, like a blast from an air horn. Hugh, this is mandatory, not optional. This is mandatory, not optional. The words send Hugh whirling back through time, back to her boyhood, and a million repetitions and variations on this phrase from his mum, she asks, jaw dropping as she stares up at the giant Borg on the doorstep. It's at least 3 meters high, silvery and fluid, thin as a schwa, all a shimmer with otherworldly transcendent what's name. It's neither beautiful nor handsome, though it's intensely aesthetically pleasing, in a way that demands some sort of genderless superlative that no human language has ever managed. Hugh hates it instantly, especially since she suspects that the lower riding it might be but descended from one of his awful parents. Yes, dear, the Singularity booms. I like the regendering, it really suits you. Your father would send his best, by the way, if he was still hanging around the solar system. Hugh last saw her parents at their disembodiment. They'd already had avatars running around in the cloud for years, dipping into meat space every now and again for a resync with their slow-code bioinstances dirt side. When they were finally deconstituted into a fine powder of component molecules, it had been a technicality, really, a final flourish in their transhumanification. But the finality of it, zeroing out their bodies, had marked a break for Hugh. Mum and Dad were now technically dead. They were technically alive too, but that was beside the point. Until Mom donned a golem and came to talk. "Mum, I don't talk to dead people," Hugh says. "Go away." She deliberately does not slam the door, but closes it, and turns the latch and heads back to the sink, deliberately ignoring the fragment of cloud wearing her mum's memories. She manages to go 3 steps before the door splinters and tears loose of its hinges, thudding to the painstakingly restored tile floor in the front hall with a merry tinkling of shattered antique glass. "Love, I know you're not best pleased to see me, but you've been summoned, and that's that." The spirit of adolescence descends on Hugh in a red mist. Her mum has always been able to reduce her to a screeching tea kettle of resentment. "Get out of my house, Mum! I hate you!" Her mum's avatar grabs Hugh in a vicious hug that feels like foam rubber padding wrapped around titanium armatures. "Poor thing," it says. "I know it's been hard for you. We did our best, you know, but, well, we were only human. Now come along, sweetie." Here's Tripoli all over again, but this time the golem whose grasp she can't escape emits a steady stream of basso profundo validations of Hugh's many gifts and talents, and how proud her parents are of all she's achieved and such like. Hugh tries to signal a beadle moat, but her mum's got some kind of diplomatic semaphore that makes all the enforcement wear give it free passage. Mum's bot stops at every traffic signal, and several times Hugh tries to get passers-by to help her, with lines like, "I'm being kidnapped by the bloody Singularity." Unfortunately, nobody seems interested in lending a hand, and even if they did, Mum goes about 200 kilometres per hour between traffic lights, her gait so fast that every time Hugh opens her mouth to scream, it fills with wind, and her cheeks wibble and wobble while she tries to breathe past the air battering at her windpipe. Then they've arrived. The Alien Consulate is mid-fab, its hairy fractal edges radiating heat as nanites grab matter out of the sky to add to it. The actual walls are only waist high, though the spindly plumbing, mains and network infrastructure are already in place and teeter skyward, like a disembodied nervous system filled with dye for an anatomical illustration. The console is an infinitely hot and dense dot of eyeball-warping fuzz in the exact centre of what will be the ground floor. Well, it's not exactly infinite, but it does seem to bend the light around it, and it certainly radiates too much heat to approach closely. "Thank you for coming," it says. "You bought your invitation, I hope." "Fuck you, no!" Hugh screams. She's gathering breath for another outburst, but Mum shakes her. Gently by golem standards, but hard enough to rattle the teeth in her jaws. "Bad idea, darling." A palpable cone of silence descends around Hugh's ears as Mum confides. "When I said it was mandatory, I was serious. If you don't comply, it'll delete everyone." "Fuck!" Hugh pauses. "Delete?" She realises that everything outside the cone of silence has stopped. Stuck in a bizarre meat-space cognate of bullet time. Birds hanging on the wing in mid-air. Leaves frozen in mid-fall. That sort of thing. "Yes, dear, I'm not exaggerating. It's come to pay us a visit from the next level, and faster, smarter thinkers than you or I are crapping themselves." Hugh is rattled. Mum always had an accurate appreciation of her own abilities, and as a Fields Medal winner she wasn't inclined to hide them under a bushel. But it's playing by the rules, apparently. There's got to be a public inquiry, which means statements by witnesses and friends of the court and so on and so forth. All very tiresome, I'm sure, but it seems your name came out of the hat first. So I'm afraid you're back on jury duty. Like it or not. If it's any consolation, I'll try to make this painless. The birds and the bees resume their respective chirping and buzzing as the cone of silence collapses on Hugh like an icy waterfall of fear. "Shit biscuits!" she screams, as Mum gently wraps a band of silvery shimmering nanomanipulators around Hugh's head and saws off the top of her skull. over to Cory.
So, as you've just heard, Hugh is forcibly transcended. And later on in the story, this section I'm going to read, she's finally been taken off to the Galactic Civilizations holding pen for expert witnesses, which is a giant, tasteless replica of the Burj Khalifa made out of the bones of the moons of Jupiter, which have been co-opted as a temporary computronium outpost. It's so tasteless that the doorman is a giant gorilla. "I hope you enjoy the facilities here," says the gorilla with a wink. "Nothing but the best for our expert witnesses. We have hot and cold running everything." It's a far cry from jury duty accommodation in the crappy backpackers hostel in dusty Tripoli. Hugh dials her time right up, sinfully extravagant, and orders the whirlpool-equipped hot tub with champagne to appear in the bathroom. Then she climbs in to marinate for subjective hours, a handful of seconds in everyone else's time frame, and to unkink for the first time in ages. After all, it's not as though she's consuming real resources here, and she needs to relax, needs to recenter her emotions the natural way and do some serious plotting. Of course, the sim is far too realistic. A virtual champagne bath should somehow manage to keep the champagne drinking temperature cold while still feeling warm to the touch, and it shouldn't be sticky and hot and flat. It should feel like champagne does when it hits your tongue, icy, bubbly, and fizzy. And when Hugh's non-bladder feels uncomfortably full and relaxed in the hot liquid and she lets loose a surreptitious stream, it should be magicked away, not instantly blended in with the vintage Veuve Clicquot to make an instant tub's worth of piss mimosa. This is what comes of having too much compute time at one's disposal. Hugh seethes. In constraint, there is discipline, the need to choose how much reality you're going to import and model. Sitting on an IO's worth of computronium has freed the Galactic Authority, and isn't that an unimaginative corker of a name, from having to choose. And with her own self simulated as hot and wide as she can be bothered with, she can feel every unpleasant sensation, each individual sticky bubble, each droplet clinging to her body as she hops out of the tub and into a 6-jet steam shower for a top-to-bottom rinse, and then grabs a towel, every fiber slightly stiff and plasticky, as if fresh out of the wrapper and never properly laundered to relax the fibers, and she dries off. She discovers that she is hyper-aware, hyper-alert, feeling every grain of knot dust in the knot air individually as it collides with her knot skin. Oh, enough, she wants to shout. What is the point of all this rubbish? This is the thing that Hugh has never wanted to admit. Her primary beef against the Singularity has never been existential. It's aesthetic. The power to be a being of pure thought, the unlimited, unconstrained world of imagination, and we build a world of animated GIFs, stupid sight gags, lame van art avatars, brain-dead, playful environments, and brain-dead flame wars, augmented by animated emoticons that allow participants to express their hackneyed ad hominems, concern trollery, and violations of Godwin's law through the media of cartoon animals and oversized animated genitals. Whether or not Sim Hugh is really Hugh, whether or not uploading is a kind of death, whether or not post-humanity is immortal, or just kidding itself, the single inviolable fact remains. Human SimSpace is no more tasteful than the architectural train wreck that the Galactic Authority has erected. The people who live in it have all the aesthetic sense of a senile jackdaw. Hugh is prepared to accept, for the sake of argument, mind, that uploading leaves your soul intact. But she is never going to give 1 nanometer on the question of whether uploading leaves your taste intact. If the Turing test measured an AI's capacity to conduct itself with a sense of real style, all of SimSpace would be revealed for a machine sham. Give humanity a truly unlimited field, and it would fill it with Happy Meal toys and holographic Sports Star collectible trading card game art. There's a whole gang of dirtside refusenicks who make this their primary objective to transcendence. They're severe Bauhaus cosplayers, so immaculately and plainly turned out that they look more like illustrations than humans. Hughs never felt any affinity for them. Too cringeworthy, too like a southern belle who comes down with the vapors at the sight of a fish knife laying where the dessert fork is meant to go. It's always felt unserious to object to a major debate over human evolution with an argument about style. But Hugh appreciates their point and has spent his and then her entire life complaining instead about the ineffable and undefinable humanness that is lost when someone departs for the cloud. She's turned her back on her parents, refused to take their calls from beyond the grave. She shut herself up in her pottery with only the barest vestige of a social life, remade herself as someone who is both a defender of humanity and a misanthrope. All the while, she's insisted to herself, mostly to herself because, as she now sees with glittering clarity, no one else gave a shit, that the source of her concerns all along has been metaphysical. The reality that stares her in the face now, as she reclines on the impeccably rendered 20 million count non-Egyptian, non-cotton, non-sheets, is that it's always been a perfectly normal, absolutely subjective, totally meaningless dispute about color schemes. And now she's got existential angst. The Burj Khalifa's in-room TV gets an infinity of channels, evidently cross-wired from the cable feed for Hilbert's Hotel. It uses some evolutionary computing system to generate new programs on the fly every time you press the channel up button. This isn't nearly as banal as Hugh imagined it might be when she read about it on the triangular folded cardboard stand-up that materialized in her hand when she reached for the remote. That's because, as the card explained, the Burj has enough computation to model captive versions of Hugh at extremely high speed, and to tailor the programming by sharpening its teeth against those instances in a bottle, so that every press of the button brings up eye-catching, attention-snaring material. It's mostly softcore pornography that involves pottery. Hugh would like nothing better than to relax with the gogglebox and let her mind be lovingly swaddled in intellectual flannel, but her mind isn't having any of it. The more broadly parallel she runs, the more metacognition she finds herself mired in, so that even as she lies abed, propped up on a hill of pillows the size of a Celtic burial mound, her thoughts are doing something like this. Oh, that's interesting. Never thought of doing that sort of thing with glaze. Oh, too interesting. If you ask me, it's not natural, that kind of interesting. They've got to be simulating gigahues to come up with that sort of real-time optimization. There'll be hordes of Hugh instances being subjected to much less interesting versions of this program and winking out of existence as soon as they get bored. Hell, I could be one of those instances, my life dangling by a frayed thread of attention. Every time I press the channel up button, I execute thousands, millions, billions of copies of myself. Why don't I care more about them? It's insane and profligate cruelty, but here's me blithely pressing the channel up button. Whoa, that's interesting. She looks awfully like Bonnie, but with a bum that's a little bit more like that girl I fancied in college. I could die at any instant just by losing attention and pressing channel up. That's wild. I never noticed how those muscles, the quadrati lumborum, spring out when someone's at the wheel. That bloke's got QLs for days. If I were really aesthetically opposed to this sort of thing, I'd be vomiting in my mouth with rage at the thought of all those virtual people springing into existence and being snuffed out. But I'm not, am I? Hypocrite, liar, poseur, mincing aesthete. That's me. So long as it's interesting and stylish, I'll forgive anything. I've got as much existential introspection as a Mario sprite. Enough already, she tells herself, and cools herself down to a single thread, then throws that down, hunting for the sweet spot at the junction of stupidity and calm. Then, finding it, she settles down and watches TV for 100 subjective years, slaughtering invisible hordes of herself without a moment's further thought. Satori. So that's the reading. Somewhere on there is a power button, or is that controlled off a console? So we're now free to take your questions. We can share the mic if we can't figure out how to get that one. How many science fiction writers does it take to turn on a wireless mic? All of them, apparently. So are there any questions? Yeah.
Would I be correct in guessing that you read sections primarily written by yourselves?
No.
I don't think so.
No, there's a lot of interwriting in both of those passages. They're really interwritten, those two particularly. Those are among the passages where when I read them, I'm like, that looks like my tick and that looks like Charlie's tick, and who the fuck wrote that?
Yeah, we were swapping over about every 500 to 1,000 words, and both of the passages we read are well over 1,000 words, so...
And we did lots of re-editing of each other's stuff. So there are some interesting offcuts lying around in our hard drives, too. Other questions? We actually could figure out who wrote those because I at least did version control with them. A friend of mine wrote me some Python scripts that are in GitHub called Flashbake, and every 15 minutes they grab all my working files and then they check them into a local Git repo with the... it figures out what time zone I'm in from my IP address, where I am from my IP address, the last 3 songs I listened to, the last 3 headlines I posted on Boing Boing. And then just logs it. And I figure, in like 10 years, it'll be kind of interesting to go back and look over it. I've also been thinking that I could probably do something more interesting these days, like take a picture every 15 minutes and
blood pressure
from the picture, skin galvanometry, skin response from the touchpad, and probably more. I mean, I'm sure like eventually the mic will be sensitive enough to grab things like heart rate and so on too.
Is that Thomas Gideon?
That's Thomas Gideon. Yeah. He's a good guy. You know him. He has a great podcast called The Command Line, and he works for New America Foundation now. He's one of the Internet in a Box guys.
I like living dangerously. I just basically left my backups to Time Machine on the laptop. Having said that, we worked on this as just a markdown file bounced back and forth in email, and as long as the email folders are thoroughly backed up, I've got different snapshots all the way through.
Yeah, I mean, this all started with the Merrill Collection in Toronto, which is the largest public science fiction reference library in the world, started by Judy Merrill, who was kind of my mentor when I was younger. They logged my papers for me because when I started selling novels, I was moving continents like every 18 months. And especially back then, every novel you sold involved 3 lumps of paper at least about this big. There's like the initial manuscript and then the marked up manuscript and the typescript and so on. And there was no way I could manage them. So they just keep my papers for me. And one day the head librarian, Lorna Toulis, said, it's such a pity because in the old days we used to get multiple distinct drafts from our writers, and this was obviously very interesting to scholars in subsequent years. And now there's just the kind of the rolling text file that then gets turned into a book. If only there were some way to keep track of the changes to a text file. And I was like, this is the canonical solved problem, right? So that's where it all started. Are there other questions? Yeah.
Do you have any joint projects planned in the future?
We will talk about it at the end of this tour if we haven't strangled each other first.
Yeah, I mean, everything is possible. We might upload and fork new instances to work on books together or something. It's possible. We both have a lot of stuff on the go at the moment. And we're both contributing to a project, although we're not collaborating directly on it. Neil Stevenson is working on this thing, Hieroglyphics, with Arizona State. That's science fiction stories built on real science, credible, plausible science. I'm working on a story about burners who create a playa dust printer that is so successful that they drop it on the playa at 4th of July celebration at the start of the summer, and by Labor Day weekend, it's printed out their yurt. And they live in it for the Burning Man, and then they chop it up into pieces and pack it out. And they're so happy with it that they decide to build one that does lunar regolith. And they use a private space exploration vehicle to drop one on the moon, and they spend a generation reprogramming its firmware by bouncing ham signals off the moon and building a lunar habitat that their grandchildren can move into. And Charlie, what story are you working on?
Well, I was meant to be working on the third of a trilogy beginning with Halting State and Rule 34, this being the political one, titled The Lambda Functionary. But it's going to take me about 2 years to write, as it's sort of set 15 years out, and trying to do near-future SF like that is really hard these days, thanks to people like you. So I'm negotiating with my agent to hand in a different, the 5th laundry novel instead.
But what are you working on for Neil, for the hieroglyph thing?
I haven't even confirmed I'm on that yet. I want to be, but I'm juggling too many balls right now.
Sam?
So you guys have any parts of this, like when you're collaborating on a shared work like this, are there parts of it that you had to give up?
Maybe not that we wish we could have kept, but there's definitely big chunks that got off-cut.
Yeah, a lot of arguing over whether something belonged in it and then rewriting.
Yeah, there's nothing that I like more and over much, but there's plenty of stuff on the cutting room floor.
I mean, think of it as a kind of half-assed version of pair programming mediated. If you were emailing source files back and forth to each other and working at 400 miles apart rather than in the same room.
Yeah. I just read an early edition of the new David Byrne book, How Music Works. It's an amazing book, and there's a section on it on how he collaborated with Eno on Everything That Happens Will Happen Today, the album they did a couple of years ago. And Eno had actually written all the melodies, and so they were like sort of sitting on his hard drive, and so he fired them off to Byrne, and then Byrne figured out the words, and he was like, I could go back and ask for like melodic changes, but there's kind of a hassle to that, so I'm just going to work with this as a constraint. It's a pretty interesting passage in a very, very good book. I heartily recommend it. It'll be out in about a week. I've got a review queued up on Boing Boing that may remind you if you read Boing Boing. Scott, you had a question?
Yeah, I'll go about the process. You get it off in like 5 minutes. Do you have like that as a maximum? Or could you write as much as you felt inspired to on that day?
I mean, I think it would have been bad form to do too much in one go.
Yeah, but the main thing was to keep momentum going, so we had to turn it around within 48 hours. And, 500 to 1,000 words is a reasonable day's polished output, especially when you're trying to do something high concept.
And when you're rewriting the stuff that came before, so you're taking a pass through the piece that came before.
I think the longest chunk I mailed to Cory at one point was about 2,500 words at a time when you were traveling and not able to work on it for a couple of days.
Yeah, and that's about how I did it. I did that novella with Ben Rosenbaum, True Names, and that's about how we did that too. Although Ben likes to talk a lot about what you're writing. He used to send me long, so here's what I'm thinking. I don't know if you've ever met Ben or heard him talk. It comes through. It's like, so here's what I'm thinking. There's this thing, and there's other thing, and this other thing, and this other thing. And I'd be like, yeah, Ben, can we just write it? I know. And he was like, I'm overthinking it again. We were a little more compatible in that regard. There was less foreplay, more of the important stuff.
I didn't know you cared.
Yeah.
Currently work on the same project at the same time, would it be more beneficial for you or less beneficial?
Would Google Docs be more beneficial or less?
This probably isn't the right venue to confess that I hate low-end fair cloud computing systems that don't actually have an in-my-pocket fallback. The trouble with Google Docs for this sort of thing, firstly, we were working on one long continual scrolling text, and by the time you're up to about 90,000 words, Google Docs is not terribly happy. The other aspect is it requires you to be online with a good internet connection, and if you're traveling or you live somewhere where the internet is up or down, that's not so good either.
And in particular, if those moments in which there's no network are the moments that you're like, oh wow, there's nothing else that I can be doing right now, no high priority items that I can take care of because I've got network access, now's the moment when I can write, then Google Docs is no good to you at all. I've got the sequel to Little Brother coming out in February, and I wrote big chunks of that. I wrote that at like 2,000 words a day, and I did it while touring. And a lot of it while touring Germany. So the German tour is really interesting. See, I was touring a young adult book, so I would go to schools and with my translator would read for half an hour, and then I'd read for half an hour because they're Europeans, they speak better English than I do. And while my translator was reading in German, I would have half an hour to sit there on stage and write. If I needed network access, I would have been hosed. So I never would have finished that book.
First, I love the reference to I was an infinitely hot and dense Scott.
Yeah, Mark Lehner.
Yeah, that was really my introduction in a lot of ways to cyberpunk, so that was great. But the other thing I was going to ask Mr. Stross, I was actually introduced to your writing by Paul Krugman's blogs.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just wondering if he's never mentioned meeting you that I've read, so I was just wondering.
Oh, yeah, we have met. It was at the World Science Fiction Convention about 3 years ago in Montreal, where they sort of arranged to put us on stage. And it's the second most terrifying thing I've ever done on stage, is go up on stage in front of 1,000 people and cameras with Paul Krugman and try not to look like a fool.
It's on YouTube.
Yeah. Note I say the second most terrifying thing. To give you something that exceeds that for sheer blind terror was an event about 15 years ago when I went on stage while a guy who was into medieval longsword reenactment demonstrated killing strokes with a broadsword using me as a model. And what I knew and the audience didn't know was that this guy had macular degeneration and was registered blind. He only had 2% of his visual field left.
Wow.
Going up with Paul Krugman was sort of the intellectual equivalent.
Are you saying Paul's blind?
No, I'm saying he's the equivalent of your sort of blind sensei.
Oh, right, I see.
Just doing something that should be impossible.
In the back.
Well, first of all, thanks to both of you for your blogs, and thank you also for the recommendations you made. You would have read any of it, not the full. But I want to ask you both, you touched on this a little in the introductory remarks. Ray Kurzweil, the debate I've heard about it is whether he's scientifically grounded with a very strong speculative component, or basically speculative fiction marketing itself as scientifically grounded. And I've heard the sciencey perspective on that, but as two authors in speculative works, I'm curious what sort of perspective you have on his work, especially in the context of this novel.
I just got a real strong sense of deja vu when I read some of his books because I'd seen this stuff 10 years earlier on the Extropians mailing list. I should say no more.
Well, I mean, I interviewed Ray for Asimov's Science Fiction Magazine. It's online, and you know, the summary of kind of where I netted out with this is that there's an underlying question that Ray treats as kind of one on which there's broad consensus that in fact we don't have any broad consensus on, and that's the locus of identity. Not the locus of consciousness, but the locus of identity. So imagine that you had to uploaded a copy of yourself, and you wanted to like, what's the command, tar-t or whatever, to verify the archive. You wanted to verify your archive, right? So the one way to do that is you could do a Turing test. So, you know, 2 Chinese rooms, you're in one, the uploaded you is in the other, and someone gives you stimulus. They ask you questions, and if the questions line up, the answers line up, the same identical response to stimulus, we'd say, okay, it's the same person. But there's a problem with that, which is that if I took you 5 years ago and stuck you in a room and then took you today, you wouldn't give the same answers. So there's a kind of reductionist story, there's a kind of Socratic dialogue that takes place in the Singularity literature in which you have someone who's a skeptic and someone who's a guru or believer. And the skeptic says, if you upload me into a computer, I will no longer be me. And the guru leads them through this dialogue where they say, well, what if I replaced one of your legs with a robot leg? Would you still be you? And the person says, why, of course I'd still be me. And what if we moved it 1 inch higher, right? And you just keep going until you get to the brainstem. And then you go, well, at what point do you cease to be you? Or you can do it in the other direction, right? Your pupil is the end of your optic nerve, so you can see just like your teeth at the end of your skeleton, right? So if I took that part of your brain right there that we can all see, and I replace that with a microchip, as there's already CCDs that people hook up to optic nerves and in experimental medical contexts. Are you still you? Part of your brain is now a machine, and then you just go millimeter by millimeter back, and again until you reach the brainstem. You say, at what point do you cease to be you? And that sounds plausible. It's a nice word game to play, but actually, if you were a concert pianist and I cut your hands off and replace them with robot hands, you wouldn't be you, right? If I put you prior to this gross insult to your anatomy and you afterwards in Chinese rooms and asked you questions, you wouldn't be you. And I've come to think that although we exist in a continuum of identity, right, from moment to moment, the difference between the answers that we would give in the Chinese room experiment are near enough to identical as makes no never mind, that across certain distances or across certain singularities, across certain punctuated events, those answers change in the same way that all of the stages between Latin and French are mutually intelligible, but Latin and French are not mutually intelligible. Or all of the intermediate stages between speciation and 2 finches are mutually compatible, but once you're fully speciated, by definition, you're no longer compatible. And that because we can't agree on who I am and who you are and where the locus of identity is, because we've never had to answer the question, because we never had a meaningful way to say, well, here's 2 of you, which one is the real one? That because we can't do that, there's this enormous question that we elide, when we talk about uploading, when we talk, that this is an important question in the Kurzweilian sense, maybe not in the Vingian sense, right? Are you still you once you're in the computer? Is a question that matters a lot to you, right? It may not matter a lot to the singularity, but it matters an awful lot to you. And if we can't even agree on what you means, then I think we have a hard time answering that question. And I think that that little cheap Socratic dialogue is a trick that is used to misdirect us, deliberately or otherwise, from a pretty important existential problem that's new, and that at least new in the sense that it may be non-hypothetical in the near future, and that newness is something that we have yet to come to grips with.
On the other hand, I will add that it is an interestingly constrained question because it is one that is subject to empirical experimentation.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Yeah. Although I wouldn't recommend starting with human volunteers. Take something like lobsters.
Charlie has written about uploaded lobsters. Yeah.
Right. So this thing about uploading yourself and it's still you. We can have a much smaller version of the argument. People change their hairstyle and say, "Oh, this is the new me." Mm-hmm. Just that very statement that by changing your hairstyle you become a new you should really give us the answer of what happens when you upload yourself.
Well, you could change nothing, and someone could fly an airplane into a building in your hometown, and you would probably be a different person too, right?
Let me ask a different variant on it. Here is a tablet. Is this tablet part of me? Obviously not. Okay, take into account the combination of programs, configuration, and data loaded onto it, including chunks which definitely came out of my mind, which are part of my extended phenotype. Is it part of me? This is the argument on are tools part of our identity. We relate to them as if they're extensions of our body, or are they separate? It's sort of reverse of the amputation and artificial leg question.
Sure. I mean, if you've got 100 times more non-human cells in your body, symbiotes, than you have human cells, which you do, and if you remove them, you would die, which you would, then, who are you? Are you a colony organism that just thinks that it's a single entity, or are you a ship on which many passengers that have no that are nevertheless somehow under your volitional control hitch a ride on? I mean, I think that these are really important, weird questions that we haven't quite answered.
Another version.
Yeah.
Life logging. I assume everybody's more or less familiar with the idea of life logging. You carry video cameras, mics, GPS, other data recorders around with you, blood pressure monitors.
Compromised mobile phones.
Yep, internal biological monitors. You record everything, you tag everything. We have reasonable speech to text. We have reasonable recognition of objects in the real world. I mean, you guys here have been part of a company that's developed a lot of that stuff. Okay, imagine that everything around me is logged and tagged for the whole of my life, that you can then ask it questions, such as who was I having lunch with in such and such a city on Tuesday the 2nd last year, and get answers back. If you then couple that with an avatar generated from recordings of me, and some sort of model that has via a genetic algorithm been evolved to try and give the same responses as me, you then have a artificial representative of me, an avatar. Now, suppose somebody shoots me. Is the avatar part of me? Is it me? One argument is no. Another argument is, well, it's a component of your extended identity. Well, and it's what's left over.
In the same way that, all the stuff in your hard drive is too. Or this was a big question when AOL did that search term dump. Your search queries are an enormously personal part of you. I don't know if any of you saw, if you read Boing Boing, I wrote an obit for a good friend of mine in June. He was a hacker, free software guy. He was my age. Died in his sleep totally randomly. He was a vegetarian who did yoga and rode a bicycle everywhere, but had a cerebral hemorrhage. It was like you just multiply all the blood vessels in your body by the number of heartbeats you have and divide it by the failure rate, and at a certain point, some of you will have brain hemorrhages. So his family, not very technical, didn't know what to do with his computer. It was on when he died, logged into his SUSE machine, and they were just going to turn it off and stick it in a box until they could figure it out. And I was like, if you do that, you'll lose it. The platters will seize up. The computer, you'll get burgled and it'll get stolen. It'll get shredded out. It'll get wet. And this is him, right? This is everything, all the software he's written, everything he's done since he was about 14 years old, copied over and over and over. And I went with a hard drive over to the commune he founded. He lived in a kind of anarchist commune in Toronto, and copied off a terabyte of his data, which was mostly nested backups of his old data, which he, like many of us, he hadn't really thought this through and didn't really plan on what people would do with his data after he was dead. But yes, I by the time I watched rsync copy the like 10 millionth copy of Python, I was like, I probably should have deduped this before I started. But in any event, I stuck it on S3 and paid for 10 years storage so they could figure out what to do with it in 10 years. But this really was part of them, and I think we haven't come to grips at all with what to do with that. And I think that we're already kind of symbolically starting to deal with what to do with backups of people, because there's an enormous amount of personal information. Charlie, you were saying the other day that, what was the year, 2050?
Around some estimates, but around 2050, whatever social networks are still running, we can expect internet adoption to have penetrated the entire population of Earth who are functionally literate, and even some who aren't. Around 2050 is the flip-over point at which more people on the internet will be dead than alive. Because by then, the internet will have been around for, in one form or another, about 80 years, and will have hit serious takeoff 50 years earlier. A lot of people will have been on there and will have died. I mean, I would like to think I'll be alive in 2050, but I'm not optimistic, as I would be 86.
If any of you want to quit your job and do a startup, I've got a great idea. Not that I'm going to start. I'm going to write about it for The Guardian this week because I owe them a column. But basically, the idea is that you just deploy an army of biz dev people in sailcloth blue suits and khakis to go around and do deals with all the major social networks, Facebook and Google and so on, to authenticate that someone is dead and that there is someone who is empowered to receive their login credentials. And then you sell it to funeral directors. And so you come in and you're like, oh, I'm grieving, I don't know what to do. And as they're trying to upsell you on a giant tacky aluminum coffin, they're also saying, by the way, we have a service that we work with, they're very good, and they will make sure that your loved one's Facebook, Gmail, and so on, all those credentials are turned over to you so you can manage them. We deal with all the CAs and so on. It's a single point of contact, and they'll just turn over the auth credentials to you on a certified basis. I think it would be a big business. Really? What?
I've seen companies.
There are ones that will set up a memorial to export your Facebook, but there's no one who will, as far as I know, who will ease. Yeah, but there's no one who can do the authentication credentials. That's the hard part, right? It's to like convince Yahoo or Google or Facebook to hand over auth credentials to someone, and that's the part that's like logistically intensive and relationship intensive. But yeah, no, there are tons of companies that'll do an online memorial where you can export the Facebook data and get it in, but you need to have the login credentials to do it. So unless you know how to log into that person's account, then you're hosed. Yeah. Through not dying. Yeah. Yeah. So.
I've always noticed that in Singularity and sort of this uploader culture, it's never mentioned who administers the systems that run.
Are you a Singularity SRE now?
I am an SRE. And I think if we're the people who are probably more interested in uploading, but who are we going to trust to run us?
Google.
Actually, there's one novel I can think of where the novelist in question tackled that question head-on. Ian M. Banks in Surface Detail. And you probably won't like the answer.
We kind of tackle it in this. I mean, for one thing, we have a whole group of people who are uploaded and kind of LARP bureaucracy. They feel like you need a bureaucracy, and so they go to work and do boring work, even though like it's all automated. They feel like someone needs to do it. They're called the worldgov LARP.
And the clothing for their LARP is really boring.
Yeah. And we do have some self-governed systems that run capabilities environment. So there's a capabilities bar where you can't get into a fight unless the other person allows you to fight with them, and then you have a contract that allows you to fight. And there's like you can be diffed back if you violate the contract and so on. It's a pretty fun bar.
Permutation City, I think, has a pretty interesting take on it.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially, it doesn't require hardware. The other thing also has some really good takes about what it would be like to be a conscious.
Yeah.
But bear in mind, Greg Egan has sort of recanted fairly violently against the approach to AI via genetic algorithms he was pitching in that novel. Doesn't like it anymore. Has ethical qualms.
Yeah.
Hang on, over.
Oh, sorry.
That's all we have time for.
Oh, we did have someone who hadn't asked a question at all.
Okay.
Okay.
Just one quick one?
So the worlds you write about and the worlds you work on are a little bit different today, at least. How do you stay creative? How do you generate these ideas? Do you have like a process?
There's a post office box in Schenectady. You send a self-addressed stamped envelope and they send you back science fiction ideas.
There's actually, in my case, there's a little closet in the basement of the MIT Media Lab, and I have to report there for reprogramming every 2 years.
That's the one Aaron Swartz got busted for sneaking into. Now, it's the 21st century. If you can't come up with cool science fiction ideas before breakfast, you're not paying attention, you know.